Have you ever, found yourself thinking about those really old stories? The ones about beings larger than life?
Those tales of huge figures that seem to pop up everywhere, right? In almost every culture's ancient history and myths.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you wonder, what if some of those legends weren't just legends?
Hmm.
So today we're diving deep into the whole world of giants. We'll look at ancient scriptures, myths from around the globe, historical reports, even modern conspiracy stuff.
It's a massive topic, honestly. Spans millennia, cultures. It gets surprisingly complicated when you really dig in.
Right.
So, we've gathered a pretty big stack of sources for you. Things like old religious texts, historical accounts, reports on alleged discoveries, that sort of thing.
And our mission basically is to pull out the key insights, take apart the claims, and, help you sort the facts from the really fascinating fiction.
Yeah, think of this as your quick guide. You, the curious listener, get the comprehensive picture without drowning in details. We'll unpack it together.
Let's do it. Where do we start? Probably with the oldest written accounts, right?
Yeah. For giants, yeah, that usually takes us back to the Bible.
Yeah.
Genesis 6.4. There's this really cryptic passage that's caused centuries of debate.
Okay, what does it say?
It says, "The Nephilim appeared on earth in those days, as well as later, after the sons of God went into the daughters of men who bore them sons. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown."
Mighty men of old, men of renown. Wow. That phrase alone
It paints a picture, doesn't it?
it really does.
So how have people interpreted that over the years? What are the main ideas?
Well, there are basically two main camps. One view, you often find it in more conservative evangelical circles, takes it very literally,
Literally meaning.
meaning the sons of God were actual fallen angels. They left heaven driven by lust, basically, and had children with human women.
Okay, wow.
And the Nephilim, in this view, were their literal offspring, savage giants who just wrecked the place, pillaging and causing chaos.
So actual half angel, half human giants. That's
Yeah.
pretty intense. What's the other take? The other perspective is less literal. It sees the sons of God as human descendants of Seth Adam's son who stayed loyal to God.
Okay.
And the daughters of men are seen as descendants of Cain, the cursed line. So it's about intermarriage between these two groups corrupting the righteous line.
Ah, so more of a human lineage thing.
Right. And it's worth mentioning Orthodox Judaism often interprets sons of God differently, too. More like human nobles or powerful rulers, definitely not angels.
It's amazing how one short verse sparks such different ideas. But I know there's another ancient text, the Book of Enoch, that goes into way more detail, right?
Oh yeah, the Book of Enoch. It's fascinating. Not officially in the Bible for most groups, but it really expands on this whole story.
What does it add?
It says the sons of God were actually a specific group of angels called the Watchers. There were 200 of them, with 20 leaders, and they came down to Mount Hermon.
Okay.
Their job originally was just to watch over humanity.
Things went wrong.
Massively wrong. Two main leaders were Semyaza and Azazel. Azazel especially is blamed for teaching humans forbidden stuff,
Like what kind of stuff?
like making weapon swords, shields, metalworking, also cosmetics, mirrors, fancy stones, eye makeup, kind of vanity things. And darker things too, astrology, sorcery, magic. Enoch says this teaching just sped up humanity's fall into godlessness and corruption.
So Azazel brought the corrupting knowledge. What about the other leader, Samyaza?
Samyaza was more the ringleader who pushed the other watchers to actually take human wives, defying God.
Ah,
The text says they slept with the women, defiled themselves, and revealed to them all kinds of sins, and then...
then came the giants.
Exactly. And the women have brought giants, and the whole of the earth thereby has been filled with blood and unrighteousness. Those are the Nephilim offspring.
And how did God respond to all this rebellion and chaos?
Swift judgment. Angels came down and imprisoned the watchers, bound them in darkness for like 70 generations until the final judgment. And the giants themselves, Jewish legend says they were just monstrously hungry, ate everything on earth, then started eating people.
Eating people. That's
Yeah.
grim. Really drives home the whole savagery idea.
Totally. And all this escalating wickedness, the Nephilim problem,
Yeah.
it's presented as the main reason for Noah's flood.
Right, the Great Flood. God cleansing the earth.
Exactly. Washing away the Nephilim, all the corruption, starting fresh with Noah and the ark.
Okay, but wait. If the flood wiped out the Nephilim, how come giants seem to show up later in the Bible? Because they definitely do.
That's a really key question. And yeah, the Bible does mention giant tribes after the flood. It's kind of surprising.
Like who?
Well, the Amorites, for instance. Scripture describes them as tall as cedar trees, strong as oaks. They're mentioned like over 80 times.
Wow, okay.
And remember when Moses sent spies into Canaan? They came back terrified, saying they saw men of great size, specifically the Anakim.
The ones who made the spies feel like grasshoppers.
That's the line, like grasshoppers. Really gives you a sense of scale, or perceived scale anyway.
So these weren't just like a few tall guys. They were seen as actual tribes of giants.
Exactly. The most common biblical word used later on is Rephaim. And the Bible even gives us something sort of tangible with King Og of Bashan.
King Og. What about him?
His bed, it was supposedly made of iron, and it was huge, like 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Clearly meant to imply he was immense.
13 feet.
Yeah, that's big.
And the land of Ammon was also known as a place where giants lived.
Okay, and we can't talk biblical giants without bringing up the most famous one.
Goliath, of course.
Right, David and Goliath. Everyone knows that story.
Sure, but what's interesting is scholars actually debate his height. Some say maybe 6'9", which is tall, but maybe not super giant. Others stick with the traditional reading, closer to 9 feet.
Huh. So even Goliath's size is debated.
Yep. And people often forget, David and his men apparently killed 4 other giants later on, all related to Goliath from the same area.
4 others.
Yeah, and the text even notes one had a weird physical thing, 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot. Whoa, 6 fingers and toes. That's specific. That detail just sticks with you.
It really does.
So after David's crew dealt with those last few, does the Bible pretty much stop talking about giants?
Yeah, that's basically the end of the biblical narrative for giants. But the story doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. Giant tales are everywhere, globally.
Right, like in Greek mythology.
Exactly. The giants battling the Olympian gods. And Norse mythology, too. Giants are always clashing with their gods.
It's amazing how universal it is. Makes you wonder why. I heard that in Europe, people used to think giants built old ruins.
That's right. Old Roman ruins, impressive stone structures. People looked at them and thought only giants could have built this. They were also credited with carving out mountains or lakes sometimes. You find these giant folktales in Britain, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, even Bulgaria. They definitely inspired a lot of fairy tales we know.
Interesting. So we've got scripture, we've got global myths. What about like actual historical reports? Did people claim to find giant bones back then?
Oh, definitely. And these reports add a whole other layer. Take Bacchus, legendary Teuton king.
Okay.
In 1613, they supposedly found his tomb, claimed his skeleton was 20 feet tall.
20 feet. Seriously.
Well, hold on. Later, a zoologist looked at the bones and said, nope, that's a mastodon. And more recently, science confirmed it's from something called a dinosaurium, basically, an extinct ancient elephant relative.
Ah, okay. So misidentification strikes again, even way back then. Seems like a theme.
It does. But there were other claims, too. Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian, he wrote about a 9-foot Arabian giant named Galabra.
9 feet?
Yeah, supposedly brought to Rome by Emperor Claudius around 41 AD to lead a legion.
Wow.
Then in Sicily, between the 13th and 16th centuries, people kept finding large bones they called the Palermo giants. They thought they were descendants of the Cyclops or maybe biblical giants.
Palermo giants in France? I think I read about one there.
Yep, 17th century France. An anatomist claimed he saw the tomb of a giant named Izarit, supposedly 20 feet tall.
Okay, these claims are wild. What about in early America? That giant tooth found near Albany.
Ah, yeah. Early 1700s. That tooth got a lot of attention, especially from Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister.
Cotton Mather. Wasn't he involved in the Salem witch trial?
He was, yeah. Fun fact, though, despite the witch trial support, he was also a huge advocate for smallpox inoculations, which was pretty forward-thinking then.
Huh. Weird contrast. So what does he think the tooth was?
He was convinced it was proof of the giants mentioned in the Bible killed in Noah's flood. But
Let me guess. It wasn't.
nope. Later identified definitively as a mammoth tooth.
Another misidentification.
Yeah.
It really shows how belief can shape interpretation, doesn't it? But things get even crazier in America later on, right? With newspaper stories and conspiracies.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really murky, trying to separate observation from, pure sensationalism. Giants are actually a big deal in Native American myths. Nearly 24 tribes have stories.
Like the Wendigo.
Yeah, Wendigo, the Kiwaka, Maui the ice giant, lots of them. But one story really got tangled up with alleged discoveries. The Paiute legend of the Sitika.
Sitika, red-haired cannibal giants. That's the one.
That's the one. The story goes they were at war with the Paiute, who finally trapped them in Lovelock Cave in Nevada and burned them out.
Okay, that's the legend. What about
Okay.
the discovery part?
Right. So in 1911, some guys mining guano in Lovelock Cave claimed they found giant skeletons. Some reports even mentioned cannibalism. Sounds dramatic.
It does. So what did you find when you looked into that claim? This is where it gets juicy.
Well, what's really telling is that later, proper university and museum excavations happened at Lovelock Cave. Much more scientific.
Did they find giants?
Not a single mention of giants. Nothing. It really looks like the whole giant part of the 1911 story was either made up or massively exaggerated.
Huh. So where did the story even come from?
The earliest trace seems to be a book from 1882 by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, Life Among the Paiutes. She does tell a story about reddish-haired barbarians being killed in a cave fire.
But not giants.
Exactly. She never calls them giants. And then even a 1929 newspaper article about the real Lovelock expedition. No mention of giants there either.
So it sounds like newspapers in 1911 hyped it up, and then maybe the internet ran with it a century later.
That looks like the most plausible explanation. A classic case of a story getting bigger and wilder over time.
Okay. What about those claims from Wisconsin? Lake Delavan, 1912.
Right. The story there is 18 large skeletons found, supposedly with elongated skulls.
Sounds specific. Any proof?
Well, there was a lot of real archaeology done in that area, mound excavations and stuff. But for those specific giant claims with elongated skulls, there's basically no photos, no mentions in scientific journals. The only real sources talking about giants there are some old New York Times articles from the 1880s.
Just newspaper articles again. And this area had lots of ancient burial mounds, right? Built by indigenous people.
Exactly. Wisconsin was home to a major ancient Native American civilization, part of the broader mound builder cultures across North America.
I remember Lincoln mentioning them. Something about the eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds.
Yeah, he did say that. But that quote and the whole mound builder discussion back then, it's tied up with some really problematic historical assumptions.
How so?
Well, for a long time, especially during westward expansion, many European Americans just didn't believe Native Americans could have built those complex mounds. That idea didn't really change until the mid-1900s.
So they came up with other explanations.
All sorts. Maybe it was biblical giants or Vikings, ancient Europeans, the lost tribes of Israel that was popular in Mormon belief, maybe people from Atlantis, or even that God just created the mounds.
Wow. That's a lot of theories. What was wrong with them, fundamentally?
They were based on prejudice, basically. Two false ideas. One, that Native Americans weren't sophisticated enough to build mounds, and two, that the mounds were older than the Native Americans themselves.
Both wrong.
Both completely wrong. Archaeology proves Native Americans were here long before the mounds, and they were absolutely capable of building them. These theories reflected, frankly, systematic racism.
Right.
And beyond the prejudice, there's just, well, no actual evidence for any of those giant skeletons they reported finding in the mounds. Most cases were later shown to be misidentified animals or normal humans, or the evidence just vanished, if it ever existed beyond the stories.
That's a really important point to make. And it leads us straight into the biggest giant conspiracy theory, doesn't it?
Right.
The one about the Smithsonian.
Yep, the Smithsonian conspiracy. The core idea is that the Smithsonian Institute found tons of giant skeletons, knew they were real, but actively covered it up.
How?
Why, thing is, they gathered them all up and destroyed them, dumped them in the ocean, supposedly to protect Darwin's theory of evolution and hide the real history of Earth.
That's a massive accusation. Did you find any connection between the Smithsonian and these finds in your research? Any shred of truth?
Well, I did find a few old newspaper clippings that mentioned the Smithsonian. Like, a Boston paper in 1895 reported a 9-foot skeleton found in California.
Okay.
And it said it was examined by a Professor Wilson, who, it turns out, was a real respected Smithsonian guy.
Interesting. Anything else?
Yeah, a Mississippi paper in 1927 mentioned a giant skeleton from Florida being sent to the Smithsonian, so bones were sometimes sent there.
So you can see how someone might build a conspiracy from that.
You could start to, yeah. But then I found this other article from a California paper in 1934. It reported the Smithsonian was actually fed up with getting supposed giant bones. They were basically asking people to stop sending them.
Stop sending them. Why?
Because, according to the Smithsonian back then, almost everything they received was either just normal human bones, animal bones, or nothing remarkable, easily identifiable stuff.
Kind of blows a hole in the systematic cover-up theory, doesn't it?
It definitely makes it harder to believe they were hiding mountains of real giant skeletons if they were publicly saying, please stop sending us bones, they're usually not giants.
Right. And stepping back from the history in conspiracies,
Yeah.
Just scientifically, is a 9-foot or 13-foot human even possible,
Yep.
biologically?
Well, according to basic physics, specifically something called the square cube law, it's pretty much impossible for a human-like creature.
The square cube law, how does that work?
Basically, as something gets bigger, its volume and therefore its weight increases much faster than its surface area. Think cubed versus squared.
Okay.
So if you double someone's height, they'd be 8 times heavier. But their bones and muscles, their strength, that only scales up with the cross-sectional area, which is closer to 4 times stronger.
So the weight increases way faster than the strength to support it.
Exactly. At a certain size, the bones would buckle, the muscles couldn't move the weight. A bipedal creature built like us just couldn't function at those massive sizes described in some reports.
So physics itself is a pretty big argument against them. Okay, this has been, wow, quite a journey from Genesis to conspiracy theories to physics. What are your final takeaways?
Well, there are other weird beliefs out there, like theosophy, talking about giants from Atlantis being a root race. That's maybe another deep dive for another day.
Right.
What I find really interesting looking back is the timing of these giant discoveries. They seem to increase right when Darwinism was gaining ground in science.
Huh. That's weird. Why would that be?
Maybe a reaction against it, or
Right.
maybe just heightened interest in origins. Hard to say. But then discoveries decreased during the Great Depression and pretty much stopped altogether by the late 1950s.
That pattern is fascinating. It does suggest maybe cultural factors were at play, more than actual bones.
It seems likely. Nowadays, belief in these kinds of giants feels much more connected to certain religious interpretations or alternative history ideas than to any solid scientific evidence. It feels like those gaps, the gaps between solid fact and outright fiction. They're really tempting places to stick wild conspiracies.
I have to say, when I started looking into this, I was genuinely open, ready to believe, maybe. But digging through the sources, looking at the evidence, or really the lack of consistent, verifiable evidence, my perspective definitely shifted. It really seems, based on what we've discussed, that giants, at least these huge humanoids in ancient America, probably didn't exist as described.
It's often how these deep dives go, isn't it? The weight of evidence or the lack thereof kind of leads you to a conclusion.
Yeah. Well, this has been truly illuminating. We went from Genesis and Enoch through myths across the world, chased down newspaper claims, and tackled the Smithsonian conspiracy. We've really tried to unpack it all for you.
And maybe something to leave you thinking about. If belief in giants seems to flourish where science and faith kind of diverge, or where history is uncertain, what other stories, what other historical narratives might be shaped by that same human desire for the extraordinary, even when the evidence points somewhere else?
That's a great question. What stood out to you from all this? How does this change how you look at ancient mysteries, or even just how you process information? Keep thinking about it, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.